Alright, another draft physics video presentation. Draft science here on YouTube. Sorry, I keep saying that wrong. Could make that shorter. Anyway, so Google first. Yeah, Google sucks. Google taking possession of Android, not for any other purpose than, yes, it's another huge advertising stream. You know, I can put my ads all on the smartphones and make more money, and that's all the only reason. And yeah, we get some added value in the sense that something happens quicker than it would have happened. You can make lots of arguments, because if you have to finance anything the right way, people just won't do it. They lease their car, you know, I mean, people just won't wait. They won't save money to make money. They want to make money without money. You know, do it the risky way. Do it out of debt. And so, yeah, we don't have any civilized infrastructure for actually capitalizing or incentivizing or motivating. Just sort of, well, you could relate it to the virus thing, lots of different things. You know, instead of investing a little bit of money in the past working on a problem that you might know is going to show up and it would cost you $10 versus it'll cost you $1,000 later. So all of this not building the infrastructure thing, and so yeah, it was all on the horizon. It could be seen that this is the next generation of communication, the smartphone, and that there should be some sort of public again choice where you don't have to pay a corporation and all this crap. It should have stayed in the hands of people who just wanted to work and don't want to, just want to be paid for their time, don't want to be billionaires. Blah 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 blah. You can go through all the bullshit of it. But yeah, there's a huge lack of vision, in my opinion, in giving the infrastructure to another corporation, like giving the infrastructure of the PC to Bill Gates. It was just a huge mistake to give him a patent on essentially the round wheel, and it's a huge mistake to give Google ownership of the Play Store, the app engine. Yeah, just not a good idea. Bad idea all the way around. Lots of reasons. Anyway, Baldy Catz. So again, his hypocrisy is kind of obvious. So the next real debate he has, after saying, well, we can't give attention to lunatics and bad people and evil people. And what does he do? He gives attention to a crazy church that protests homosexuals at their death and has protested the Holocaust. Memorial. That overtly anti-Semitic, and that's okay. Where there was a guarantee that in our debate, that subject never would have came up. I mean, it's kind of, everybody knows that I wouldn't have had a debate with Baldy Catz about the two-slit experiment, somehow slid in some sort of Hitler rhetoric. We know that wasn't going to happen. Nobody would have bet on that horse as a probability, but there was every likelihood that some sort of anti-Semitism theory might come up when you're talking to Baptists. And again, the whole conversation is just about one subject anyway, right? The subject is God a good theory? And yes, on every way you decide what a good theory is, it fails. I mean, it fails to have any evidence that this thing exists, and then it also fails because there's no theory explaining how it could exist. There's no mechanism there's no evidence that there's any God-making mechanism in the universe, besides the fact that there's no evidence of this God thing. It's just bad theory. It's illogical on its face. I mean, belief without reason. I mean, why don't you just say, I don't know, water without wetness? Yeah, dry water. Go drink a glass of that. It makes absolutely no sense as a way of acquiring understanding of the universe, is to acquire it by reading a silly cartoon book. Of little drivelly made-up stories of, and silly stories to boot. Silly stories where you marry the woman you rape. and it's all okay then. So, rape them and take them. Silly ethics. It can make no sense to anybody rational. Really, going to a heaven where, it's not of this world. That is, you don't know your wife, you don't know people, you don't know nothing. You go to heaven as a nothing. So what does it have to do with me then? Oh, that's right, it has nothing to do with me. Okay. So that's not much of a thing to go to. And the whole Christian thing is so stupid because they have this old retarded testament and then this new somehow modern great testament, and the old one says a lot of things explicitly and the new one says almost nothing explicitly except don't get divorced. You're not going to heaven if you do. That's the bottom line, right? They don't really talk about hell much. So there's no punishment. There's just not the reward. The wonderful reward of going to Alzheimer's space. Forgetting who you are and forgetting everybody in your life. So you get to be an Alzheimer's patient forever. Isn't that just so charming? Can't wait. Anyway, retarded theory. He could just, say, why bother debating people with retarded theories? Because we're not going to debate how retarded their theory is. They're going to start debating interpretations of the statements. In one place it says kill the homos. But in this other place it says, well, don't throw rocks until you're sure you're not a homo or something. It's vaguely saying something like somehow you don't throw rocks at the homos. But it doesn't say it exactly. It doesn't rule out that you're still supposed to throw rocks at the stupid homos. And they want to have a conversation about that shit. They want to debate the interpretations of the statements in the stupid silly book. Instead of, just like the flat earth conversation. Let's debate their wacky, silly, insane, aberrant pictures. They take a few pictures that are unusual. And, unusual for a good reason. And, why, they don't even understand simple things like, if you take a fisheye lens that you distort everything in the image, that kind of thing. And let's talk about that instead of talking about the whole herd of elephants in the room, which is you believe in a conspiracy theory that means that nobody's flown in an airplane and looked out the window. We haven't put a single satellite into space. All those people are lying. We haven't taken any pictures with the cameras that we have on the satellites in space, and somehow they made up all of these globe pictures from the satellites. It's a ridiculous conspiracy theory. So why are we having this conversation? It's theoretically nonsense. Right there, it's theoretically nonsense. Nobody sailed in a boat and saw that the shore rises out of the ocean. Come on. All right, we're done. This isn't a valuable conversation. It's an insane conversation. But I ask him to have a conversation defending his physics, and what does he do? Bails out because it's I'm a taboo human. But all these lunatics, these liars, right? The flat earthers are liars, right? They're just making videos because they know there's an audience of lunatics out there. Just like Alex Jones knew there was an audience of lunatics. And I can say almost any kind of crap, and these fucking bubbas will fall for it. It's just a way to make money, and we know that, right? There's no mystery to it. He doesn't believe any of this horse shit. He just says it because he knows there's an audience for it. And you ought to ask, why is there an audience for it? Well, that's because the people who are supposed to be telling us the truth are often not telling us the truth. And that's where all of these conspiracy theories, all the energy for it comes from, is that there's so much to doubt about these professionals who are supposed to know their job. They seem just as biased and just as self-interested as the shysters they're supposed to be putting in jail. The cops aren't any better than the criminals. There's just too much of that going on. So you give people reason to doubt. There is any such thing as decent and right and correct and thoughtful and all of those good things. So anyway, all right, so enough of those two slobs, and now we'll move on to comments, and then we'll hopefully get to a Professor Lewin video that, when you're really, in hindsight, I can see every word now where there's a flaw in that assumption, a flaw in that assumption, a flaw in that assumption. You can just see the errors, the mistakes, the deliberate omissions. It's, quite glaring. So we will get to that, but first we'll do this. Yeah, okay. All right, so this, maybe I'll go down at the bottom first. Just do it the right way, I suppose. Okay, poetry I don't need. All right, Ken Wheeler thing, and sorry, I should have done this ahead of time. All right, so this is it, Ken Wheeler one first. First off, Ken Wheeler has given detailed examples. So no, he hasn't given any detailed examples. So it's just, why are you lying? Okay, he's shown nothing. He's drawn no mechanism. He's shown how if I took two magnets and they flip, he'll explain nothing about why they flip and then attract. Because his hyperboloids aren't going to do that. Okay, his toroids aren't going to do that. The horse shit he talks about isn't going to do that. Very plausible explanations for how magnetism works. How is it plausible? Again, you're saying that this magnet has some internal mechanism that causes whatever ether to swirl all over the fucking place. How does it do that? And how does that make a magnet attract and repel? It's just too stupid. Okay, what you have is a theory, and what he has is a theory. An argument is what we have, defending, okay, a model. So what I have is a model, explaining why it happens, explaining that a magnet's just filtering energy coming into it, that it's not, in fact, generating anything. Okay, the way that Ken Wheeler explains the nature of magnetism, and the nature of all things. Again, all things in the universe. He doesn't explain anything in the universe. And he sits there, he says, is very logical. I'm pointing out how it's not logical. It's not logical to think that two things swirling this way, okay, creating low pressure at the bottom and high pressure at the top, move away from each other evenly. That's not logical. I'm sorry, that's called illogical. Okay, that's like saying a dog can bite you with its anus. Okay, it's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. If you could understand that knowledge is always changing. So this is more horse shit. What do you mean? Water's getting wetter or drier or what? What are you talking about? Knowledge is always changing. Why do people say this horse shit? Some facts, the round wheel's efficiency hasn't changed in thousands of years, okay? They figured something out, it works, putting a log under something, rolling it, different things, leverage, okay, a lever. The knowledge hasn't changed any. The screw, and the value of it in different circumstances, that knowledge hasn't changed any. It's not going away fucked hard. The fact that the sun produces light, okay, at the same inverse square law that it creates gravity, those things aren't changing anywhere. Jerk. Moron. Okay, and you keep an open mind. Well, again, what does the open mind mean? That you're open to silly and insane, illogical nonsense as an explanation? It's a toroid. Don't you know that toroids cause things? Like houses to fall down? Anyway, once you look at the universe through Mr. Wheeler's theories, and what are the theories? You can't even understand them. Counter space? What the fuck? Why don't you say just counter ether, or counter blob, or counter jello? But counter space? It's a retarded statement. It's an illogical combination of words. Counter nothing? The opposite of nothing is something. Well, why didn't you just call it something then? Why would you call it Mr. Opposite of Nothing? Why would you do that? Why would you do that, the artist formerly known as Prince thing, right? I mean, you have to be on drugs to do that. All right. You will start to see that all mysteries seem to make sense. I'm sorry, that just doesn't make any sense at all. You think you're wooey, wah, woo, wah, wah, wah. Somehow it's going to make sense? No. It's a material universe. We're just robots. We're just fed crap and then we regurgitate them. That's it. Obviously, Ken Wheeler, okay, immersed himself in gibberish, and now he speaks gibberish. It's not complicated. Okay, the particle versus wave theory argument of the nature of electricity, it's something that no one will ever prove. Now, isn't that just so funny? You know, so you have an agenda, clearly, to say something that's stupid when clearly I've demonstrated how the wave theory has no balls at all. It doesn't exist as a rational theory because there really isn't any evidence that there's any such thing as waving individual particles. That calling a line of soldiers a wave of soldiers isn't really being honest. Okay, you know they're individual soldiers and they have individual little swords on the end of their guns and they're going to do individual stabbings. Okay, they're not going to do anything as a wave. Yeah. All right. Well, it's just so stupid. You know, you're making declarations about what will or will not be proven. I'm saying it will be proven that all events happen because electrons move in straight lines. Actually. Okay, the science can be explained, I mean, little tiny straight lines, right? From our perspective, they don't look very straight, just like the edges of the text on this screen. If I blow the text up, I'll see a bunch of jagged edges, right? Yeah, so electrons look nice and, you know, blah, 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 but yeah, they're really going all kinds of herky-jerkies, right? But they're all straight. The herky-jerky is really incredibly straight. Okay, and makes sense both ways. Well, fuck you. There's no sense made. Mathematics can explain both theories. What does that even mean? What does that mean? I don't even... Mathematics can explain both theories. What the fuck could that mean? It's not English. It's not a rational putting together of words. Even had my own theory based on electricity being a particle. However, I do not claim that my theory is the final answer. Well, yeah, I guess I have to go to your channel then. Do you actually have your theory somewhere? Just because it's mine. So you're making the claim that I'm as dumb as you and might think that my theory's right because it's my theory. No, I think a theory's right because, as I've pointed out, it satisfies the conditions. It explains all of the evidence and does it cleaner, neater, with simpler mechanisms. No gods involved, no angels, no gremlins, no magical bent anything, no magical counter space. Woo. Oh, God, dude, people are just so pathetic. Okay, well, I'll save this for later. Find out who this douche is. But what a pile of shit talk. Playlist, so he doesn't have any content. Vortex math. See, he's just so into the vortex, the tornado at the core of the universe, and the rest of it's karaoke. Oh, fuck. Now I'll delete it. Ugh. What a pile of shit. Alright, hallmark of intelligence are consciousness and clarity. No, that doesn't have anything to do with it. So, yeah, I forgot to mention the Simon Dan guy left a PS on my video. Trying to justify, okay, his piece of the Drake, one piece of the Drake equation that he included that he should have just said is too ridiculous. And it's the piece where they go from, what's the odds of an intelligence? Okay, so you have an intelligence existing. And by intelligence, we don't mean rabbit. Okay, by intelligence, we mean human. All right, so you've acquired vocabulary and you're communicating with each other. Now, what's the odds of that organism making noise? That was the question. What's the odds of that organism making noise? So I'm just saying there's no way you can imagine anything that acquires communication. That means it can store information. That means it learns how everything works. It's just like us. As soon as we can communicate and we have a language, we're going to see that there's people other places and we're going to say, hey, let's have 2 tin cans with a wire. Well, guess what? As the wire vibrates, it's making noise. Okay, it is actually sending signals. Okay, they're not very loud. But obviously, as it gets more and more sophisticated, it's going to make more and more noise. And then if it's living on a little island, it's going to eventually say, let's make noise on purpose and see if anybody can hear us. They're going to throw bottles into the sea and see if a bottle comes back with some other kind of gibberish written on it. Yeah, that's what they're going to do. And it's going to be, 100% of intelligent things are going to make noise. There's no doubt about it. There's no conceivable definition of how intelligence grows. Intelligence arrives on Earth and doesn't sit there and make a lot of noise because it starts to figure out how all this stuff works, how the universe works, and how to manipulate it. And it's going to start manipulating it. So there's no way there isn't a 100% correlation between the existence of intelligence and the existence of noise making. It's just guaranteed. You can't really imagine any scenario where a civilization could sit in a place for 1 billion years with intelligence, figuring out how the world works, and not make noise. It's not theoretically possible. Yet he tried to defend it. Fuck. That's science. It's just fucking retarded. Alright, so that's the pontificating horseshit from the senile old coot. Alright, so anyway, that's just, it's poetry, so shut up. I deserve that. Thanks, Gary. I don't know what you got, but yes, probably did. But I wouldn't be sure about it because I'm sometimes a little trigger happy. Anyway, back up the claim with something rational and real-world evidence. Well, I do back it up with real-world evidence. I mean, I'm clearly making claims that Professor Lewin's doing it wrong. I'm going to show him doing it wrong, saying it wrong, describing it wrong, just missing the entire boat. I mean, the boat, he stepped and he didn't hit anywhere near boat. Okay, so that's just a fact, asshole. So why don't you explain how the professor missed the boat? Okay, in my business, we have a process that separates oil from the citrus fruit peels on a massive volume. So you make a cleaner of some kind. How interesting. Okay, the process, simply put, is not sharing the electron from one atom to another, but permanently removing the electron to the orbital shelf of another atom. So you're making atoms? You're doing some sort of... Can you make gold that way too? Anyway, we use energy for the process. And so again, you're saying that you have to heat this stuff. Is that your argument? We have to heat it? Or you have to, shove electricity through it to cause the making of ions, which is exactly what I stated. Okay, a lot of it. And when you're doing this changing of it's an electron, you mean you make it magically jump from, so there's an electron inside an atom over here, and there's an electron over here, and you just make the electron magically jump, right? So your process is that it magically jumps into the other electron, the other atom. It doesn't have to get there by first creating ions. Yeah, duh. Oh, God, too stupid. Anyway. Alright, the electron to the orbital shelf of another electron. Okay, energy for the process, a lot of it. Not light or magnetism. Well, you don't think you couldn't use light to heat something? So that's pretty dumb. Of course you could, there's absolutely no law against it, except we can't make light perfectly efficiently. But we're getting closer and closer, right? I mean, LEDs are pretty efficient. We use energy for the process, a lot of it, not light or magnetism. So again, you don't understand how magnetism can be used to stir objects inside of a liquid and heat it up and all that kind of crap. Or any industrial chemical process that uses energy, or any other industrial chemical process. So what do you use for the energy? If you have a schematic of the process to use magnets or light in this process, patent it. Well, you didn't explain what the process was. So how can I give you the evidence of that? But clearly what you can do is you can inject little tiny magnets into some kind of fluid, and then you can manipulate those magnets and cause the fluid to heat up. So there's all kinds of ways you can do it. And become the next billionaire. I don't think your whole industry is all that much of a billionaire. So I don't think you became one doing your magic, whatever your magic is. Your magic orange peel sauce. and start a version of server farms. Uh, it'll be you, Tess, whatever this Tess, and Cybro, and whatever this is, uses energy to produce all that Zyklon B. Oh yes, the cyanide. So he throws this in for what purpose? And used to gas Jews and political dissidents. So again, what are you bringing it up for? Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? Yes, it's a very good question. Do you always have to be right or the smartest guy in the room? Question mark. No, but it just turns out that way, doesn't it? Yeah, it's not my fault you're an imbecile. It's not my fault you're stupid. It's not my fault that you think you magically move electrons from one atom to another atom without first creating ions. It's not my fault you're really stupid. Okay, so yeah, I'll block him after this one. He has another comment, so we'll just remove this one. But fuck you. I mean, bringing up that Holocaust shit was totally unnecessary. Probably the cowboy pretending to be a decent human. And that's as close as he could get. So he works at some orange peel factories. Oh, I know some more details. I'll go look in Texas for orange peel factories. I disagree with the massive scale farming. Well, that's because you're an idiot. A moron, a fool. You haven't looked at the statistics. I mean, the statistics are overwhelming. Okay, small farms pollute more. Small farms waste a ton of resources. Just a fact. They compared the two, okay, it's been done, okay, and small farms fail, okay. It leads to huge swaths of monoculture land. Well, so what? The land doesn't care. What do you think the land was before we got here? It was gigantic, miles and miles and miles of monoculture. That's what fucking goddamn nature does, okay. Organisms take over. Buffaloes, for example, right? Bazillions of them covered the land. You're too stupid. An increased dependence on organic phosphate fertilizers. Well, that's the whole point. There's always going to be a dependency. Where are you going to get it for your small farm either? Okay, there's always a dependency on fertilizers to make products, things that are more efficient. To plant a wheat plant and get more wheat out of it, you have to use a fertilizer, and if you don't, you planted it and you got 10% of the yield. So you went through all that work of watering it and take care of it and doing all this work, but you didn't get any fucking yield out of it, you jackass. Alright, pests becoming a massive problem due to lack of biodiversity, which is a pile of shit. It's exactly what they do. I mean, they can dump a bunch of ladybugs and do lots of things, right? If I dump ladybugs in my backyard, I'm not going to get shit out of them. They're all going to fly all over the place and be killing bugs on roses or some other kind of crap. They're not going to be doing what I want them to do. Okay, but if I dump them on a giant farm, yeah, then there's a good chance that every fucking ladybug stays on my farm and does what it's supposed to do, is kill the pest on the farm. So that's more horse shit. Increase the dependency on herbicides and pesticides. So there's no increased dependency. So again, just an irrational piece of crap you just spewed out of your mouth. There's absolutely no evidence that if you have a small potato thing in your backyard that you're not going to have the same problem with potato beetles. You're just an idiot. Which becomes less effective over time. Yeah, that's a problem. They're going to be on small farms, big farms. It ain't going to matter what size they are. If they're producing enough to feed the world, okay, then it's the same number of potato plants, and all you did was put them in different locations, which made them more vulnerable to the pests. Poisonous food, which may look good for sale, but lacks the full nutritional... Oh, so he says that the fact that you can't sell ugly fruit is the big farm's fault. No, that's the consumer's fault, shithead. And it would happen to the small farmer too. If I'm competing with another guy selling fish and my fish are fresher, then I'm going to sell more fish. Duh. My fish look better. It should have, which led to malnutrition and deficiencies in the customer ill health disease. So all this shit is a pile of crap. Okay, you've never had more efficient calorie production than they have now through scientific methods. Now, some of those methods you disagree with for some irrational reason, no doubt. But they're obviously, the more technically sophisticated you make something, often a hybrid needs to be taken care of a little bit more than, something else. So the fact that people don't understand that in third world countries, that they can't plant modern hybrids in crap soil, well, it doesn't take much of a person to figure that out. All right, deficiencies, ill health. So he's blaming all this crap like somehow small farms didn't create same problems, in terms of what, you're not going to hybridize? If we have small farms, you're saying the small farmers won't be smart enough to say, well, gee, if I, splice these two different trees together, I mate them, I might get bigger apples. You think they're not going to think that, idiot? Okay. And mask the symptoms created by the mega farm industry. So again, just generic crap, okay? Because everybody loves to hate corporations, and we're going to hate all ideas of mass production or all the efficiencies you gain out of having doing things on a large scale rather than a small scale. Are you going to try to make some kind of argument that it makes sense to put solar panels on individual roofs? You want to try to defend that one, retard? Oh, God, you're so stupid. Slowly dying of toxic poisoning from food and drugs, all in the name of profit. So, more horse shit. Their profits are made because they increase the yields. Yes. And that's going to be true for small farmers who are going to want exactly the same thing out of their farm. They're going to try to make their cows give more milk. They're going to try to do exactly the same thing. So this is just idiotic to say somehow, well, the winners did it better. Yeah, obviously the winners did it better. That's why they had bigger farms. And that's why they were successful. It's because they did the same thing the little guys were trying to do. And they did it successfully. That's the difference. Retard. Not to mention the increased dependency on Roundup type weed killers. So again, you can say that all of this stuff has somehow killed billions of people and make some silly story out of it, but it's a silly story. Because the fact is, it fed more people, which means they didn't starve to death, retard. So again, he's saying he can make the small farmers can make the efficient production. And the whole point is they can't. They need to use more oil. They need to use more energy to make the same yield, idiot. Their old little clunky tractor versus the big wheat combine. Big wheat combine is hugely efficient compared to this, old tractor with a clinkety-clankety thing running behind it. It's just a fact, asshole. Okay, which outright poison the wildlife and the earth and the consumer. And again, you're saying the small farmer wouldn't do exactly the same thing to increase his yield. No, he does do the exact same thing. The small farmer is even more reckless in how he applies all of this crap because he's not likely to get sued, where the big producer has to worry about the water and all the other crap because he knows he can get his ass sued. Okay, add to that solitary farmers suffering from isolation and depression. Well, jeez, that sounds kind of silly. It should be sort of a charming life in some respects, as long as you're not torturing animals. I farm flowers every year. I don't find it to be all that depressing. Deep in debt, working the bank who threatens to foreclose on a whim. Oh, really? So, the fact that they can't run their farm business, whose fault is that? And the whole point is they can't because they're not as efficient, and it's just a fact. They can't compete. All this so Americans can throw away 40% of the food wasted, and again, that has something to do with mass production. No, it has nothing to do with mass production and how it's more efficient. Ford didn't make people drive their cars into trees or throw them away or waste it or do any of that crap. So again, just more horse shit. Micro diversification farming would negate all this. Just a preposterous theory that any of the real circumstances change except efficiency. All you do is lose efficiency. You have the same motivations. The individual farmers will do the same thing the big farmers will do. They have the same motivations, so you're just lying to yourself to think they're all this holistic, I care about the environment horse shit. We see it right now. People sit there and put all these poisons and crap on their fucking lawns. Their lawns, for fuck's sake. They'll sit there and poison the environment for greener grass. There'd be there'd be communities of farmers working together. Oh yes, they always cooperated, farmers. They weren't in competition with each other. Oh, you're just so silly. Life would be better all around. No, there'd be a lot less food. And maybe that would be good. Yes, you kill a bunch of people by starving them to death. I mean, you know, I can see some benefits to reducing human population, but I wouldn't do it by starvation, frankly. I'd do it by limits on procreation. I think that's the more rational choice. But you're a fucking idiot. I'm sorry I wasted so much time on that crap. But I mean, these people, they have these idiotic notions of reality they don't take any account for. They just spew this horse shit like it's a fact. And it's not. We did that. I deserve that. We did that. Okay, Tesla didn't invent AC. I concur. Okay, but he's going to say exactly the opposite, no doubt. More like he perfected it. More horseshit. You can't perfect AC. It's a concept, alternating current, jackass. It's not anything more than that, okay? You can't make it into something else than that. You can't perfect Morse code, retard. All motors produce an AC current, which is, so again, not all, but anyway, which is why DC motors have communicators to rectify the AC. I don't think I'd put it that way. Yeah, I don't think I would. Are you saying the electricity? I mean, the motor that you're driving, that's a DC motor, technically, you have to convert the AC into DC first? Well, yeah, that's true, but that wouldn't change whether you have to have a communicator. I mean, the communicator is just basically saying I have to switch the magnetism. Anyway, he had fixed problems with motors and effectively harnessed the current they inherently produce. So I don't even know what that means. They inherently produce. He didn't make a generator, jackass. So this is where you're just wrong, okay? So the production of electricity from moving magnetic fields is not what Tesla did anything. And what he did is made a phase motor, okay? Phase motors are really good for like ceiling fans and places where you can't have sparky brushes, okay? So like fluid movements and, you know, pumps that you have to use in different circumstances. But their downside is they're very low torque. So they require some help to get started sometimes. And, you know, they're very good at running at one speed and blah, blah, blah. But that's it, okay? So, yeah, they have some utility. But he didn't invent the vacuum cleaner motor, okay? He didn't invent lots of AC motors that are a lot better in the sense that they produce a lot more torque. It's safe to say he invented the efficient method of AC transmission lines. So, no, it isn't safe to say that at all. There's absolutely no evidence. He worked for a company. There's no evidence that he produced any brilliant technology. It's all these other people. The little short guy that you know, what the hell's his name? He has that, you know, he changed his name, Steinmetz. There's every evidence that Steinmetz had something to do with understanding how much electricity you could put through a wire based on increasing the voltage and all of that crap. But there's no evidence that Tesla made any contribution. But breaking that down into its industrial elements, he didn't invent any of those. Oh, there you go. So you just said he invented it, but he didn't invent it. He refined them and put them into a package that could do work better than anything else. So again, you just keep making vague references to these vague things that he did, and there's really no evidence of these tremendous contributions beyond his, like I said, I mean, even the fact that he used radio to run a little sailboat, you know, there's no evidence that he invented that, okay? So Google, people are retarded when it comes to Tesla. Like Draft Science says, it's all there in his patents and his own writing. Yes, which is all gibberish, incoherent nonsense. He had this, again, the proof is in the pudding, in the sense that he spent all of this money to build a giant tower that burns holes in the earth. because he somehow thought he could send lightning to France. I mean, it was pretty fucking dumb. Okay, anything else is hyped up bunk to sell videos and books. So yeah, okay. Well, I think you're misinterpreting to say that he's got a bunch of, because somebody patented something, that somehow the thing worked. The fact is, his patents are vague, and they aren't describing something that's actually working. It's usually something he's promising will work someday. I mean, most of his patents are for a future invention. There is no current invention that he was patenting. He was patenting something that might do something in the future. I need to figure out how to make it work for nothing, for free. Yes, but that's my patent. Free energy. Yeah, I got the energy part. I just haven't got the free part figured out. But I'd like to patent free energy. I mean, that's essentially what these patents are. Okay. The Westboro Baptist Church protested a Holocaust museum, so I didn't know that. So that's another strike against old Baldy, right? I mean, such a fucking hypocrite. It's clearly evident that Baldy Cat's actual motivation for bailing out on the physics debate was not the excuse he gave. It's clearly obvious that the people he is having a conversation with are clearly a lot more evil than I am. And why is it okay to give those evil people attention, but it's not okay to give this evil person attention? Clearly, the reason is because there's no chance those dumb evil people were going to win the debate. That's the only difference. The only difference is I have a chance of making him look stupid, and the others have little chance of making him look stupid. I didn't watch the debate, but I have a sneaking feeling, though, that they came off a lot better than they should have. I'm sure because Baldy Catz and that other moron aren't very fucking smart. All right, as far as I can tell, the discussion to include the WBC was the middle finger to draft. Well, obviously, Baldy Pussy is unable to argue anyone with a legitimate argument. Well, obviously, he's exercising his prerogative to run away. I think we should all go to the bald a-hole's Twitter and post Draft Dodger to the feed. Yes, I like that. That's neat. Draft Dodger. Maybe I'll say that in the title. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, whoever this Dan guy is, he must have been exposed to some formal physics education. Magnetic energy isn't a term you'll find on YouTube or TV. So it's only for the super rational and logical and educated would use an idiotic term like magnetic energy. Okay, but it's taught in second year physics. Why don't you prove that? Why don't you show me the second year physics? Okay, because I've played Lewin's 102, 103. I've played Shakar at Yale. Why don't you show me where one of these lecturers in second or third year physics classes starts talking about magnetic energy. Physics students in high school and first year physics students in college, you've described force, X-rays, UV, gamma, electrons, protons, can relate what are the values of energy in joules, density. Again, but those are just because you're moving it. You're moving the magnetic field. It doesn't explain the arrival of the magnetic field in a regular magnet. That magnet has a permanent field. And the fact is if you swing another magnet into it, something energetic is going to happen. And the magnet is going to be repelled. And that requires energy. That's another force acting on something. It has velocity towards the magnet. It's going to be repelled by the magnet. You don't have any explanation where the energy came from to repel the velocity. That you have no explanation for. Okay, and that's not in Maxwell's equations, frankly. The source of the energy. Where was the energy the day before? Okay, the velocity of these aspects of the universe, and velocity of these aspects of the universe, question mark. So again, we need no question mark. I've basically explained that, you know, these formulas mean nothing in the sense that they're just accounting for the fact that there's real variables. Something has a velocity. Okay, it has a mass. It's moving in a direction towards a magnet. It's going to be repelled by the magnet because its orientation is opposite. Now, if it's on a string, it can't flip, so it's stuck. And so now it's going to bounce off the field of the magnet. Well, how did the magnet make the field? What is the field made out of? You have no explanation for that. Specifically, what is the energy and density of force? So again, it's just silly to say, but obviously it depends on whether it's charged or not charged. Right? I mean, the energy is in the fact of proximity, as I pointed out before. The energy of a ping pong ball depends on how close the paddles are. I make the paddles this far, the energy of the ping pong ball is less than if I bring the paddles this far close together. Because now the ping pong ball is going to have more interactions. So energy is interactions. It doesn't have anything to do with density. Clearly the density, the number of ping pong balls matters. But clearly it's related to proximity. So there's more than one variable. So you can't just say the density of force. It doesn't mean anything. The density of force is completely dependent on the proximity of the matter. How small the vessel is will decide what the density is. And there's all kinds of vessels in that sense in the universe. There's all kinds of distances between objects. So first point out the two objects, and then I'll tell you what the density of the force is. Alright. But fuck you. You know, we're done communicating here for the other Hitler crap. Fuck off. I don't have to take that shit. Nope. You can be a little rude, but preposterously rude? Fuck you. I have no obligation to communicate with the preposterously rude. Alright. Let's see. So this is the Professor Lewin video. So this is, look, to get to the part that's really important, it's 27 minutes, so we're probably not going to do all of that. So I will jump a little, but and I'll be fair to the video. I won't cheat you any, in terms of you're not going to miss anything important.
Today we're going to talk about interference of electromagnetic radiation, and I will start as a warm-up with the famous historical experiment which was first done by Young in 1801.
Now, technically it really was done by Newton, okay, in a sense that Newton had done both the interior surfaces and the exterior surface experiments. So he had done the elements of the two-slit experiment. And I almost have a feeling he did it, but you know, who knows, with two actual slits. He just didn't write about it.
By that time, the issue whether or not light was waves or whether it was particles was still unresolved. Newton always wanted light to be particles, but the Dutch physicist Huygens wanted them to be waves, and the issue was unresolved.
So again, unresolved by what standard? So it's not that the issue was unresolved, it's that the evidence wasn't clear. So the correct way to say it is there wasn't decisive evidence. You couldn't just cite up an experiment and say, there, that experiment proves this. It just wasn't enough. There wasn't enough evidence. So he says in 1801, when Young did this two-slit experiment, that somehow we now had the evidence. And the simple argument is Young didn't even see the right pattern because his experiment was so crude. So it didn't provide any evidence of anything Newton didn't already know and was already unexplained in Newton's time. It didn't add any real information. It just added a trick.
Let us agree that if light are particles, and you have a screen that, say, has two openings, and you would throw particles through there, like tomatoes are particles, and you collect them here, then don't...
So even these simple analogies, you can point out how they're so fundamentally flawed, because you could understand a mechanical mechanism. You could be fair to the argument rather than unfair, right? So I can sit here and just say, yeah, let's do it with tomatoes. And what would happen? Well, we know that some of the tomatoes are going to hit, okay, the side of the slit, and they're going to break. Piece of the tomato will fly this way, or a piece of the tomato could fly this way. And if all we're really collecting over here is an amount of tomato, you know there would be places where there'd be more tomato. Now, the key is these tomatoes have to have a certain frequency rule where they have to arrive at a certain time. That's how photons are made. So I can't really do it with tomatoes if I'm going to cheat the argument by ignoring the fact that we have a phase issue, right, with photons. We know phase is really important, and we're not going to be able to phase tomatoes, you know, unless we create some mechanism where it only counts the arrival time of a piece of tomato. But then again, we can know that, yeah, we could have that happen. We could have it happen where a tomato hits here and a tomato hits here, and a piece from this tomato goes here, and a piece from this tomato goes here, and now we have enough tomato to say a tomato hit here in that right time. So we could do it with timing and understand that, yes, if we sequence these things, that it could be possible that a tomato hits here and this tomato is spinning, so it takes longer to get here. So that one got slowed down, but this tomato, when it broke, it didn't spin. The piece just flew straight. So two of them that were in a different time, like this one happened much sooner, much earlier, like, 4 seconds earlier, this tomato hit and it spun. And this tomato didn't spin, and so it went here 50 miles an hour. So a tomato that 4 seconds ago hit the slit, and one that hits the slit right, 4 seconds later, those two could send pieces to the same location. I could say tomato. So there is a particle mechanism that works with something as crude as tomatoes, in the sense that you could understand what scatter is. And the simple argument for the photon would be as if we thought of the photon as a particle, okay, as an arrangement of particles. Then you could understand that, yeah, well, a photon can hit at different times, okay, and the photon has a distance. And the fact is that I could, if the photon is this arrangement, I could break off a piece here, and I could combine it with the equal pieces here. I could combine it with these two going here too. And then now I created a frequency that's consistent, okay, and I created a new photon. Okay, one component came from here, and the other two components came from here. And all I have to do is have a mechanism on this surface, okay, that somehow causes scatter. That is, it causes pieces to fly in all kinds of directions. And then I can remake photons, no problem. So this doesn't take much of a diagramming, much of a scrutiny, but they apply no scrutiny. They just try to mock it. They try to make it sound like, well, what if you throw Catz through, they'll just, they try to make it so it can't be plausible when it's clearly plausible. Particles don't have any huge barrier to explain scatter. Again, it's a fundamental thing that they're already conceding it happens. When force hits electrons, it scatters. They already know the phenomenon happens. So why is it somehow a grand, huge mystery and impossible to imagine how those surfaces could interfere with the constituent pieces of a photon?
Those tomatoes that don't get stuck on the screen, but that make it, would form a pile here of tomatoes, and they would form a pile there of tomatoes. That's very typical for particles. But the situation is different. So
again, the situation is different too, in that he just drew those piles when we already know that when we're going to do this with the proper analogy, okay, the analogy is to the light circumstance. We know that the two slits are very, very close to each other, okay? It's less than a millimeter of distance, that they're not going to create two piles here and a pile here. They're going to end up creating a pile that are almost right on top of each other. So again, he cheated the argument by implying that somehow the slits are much further apart. If they're just a tomato apart, okay, then obviously whatever pile they create over here, those two piles are going to be right on top of each other. And so, this scatter is going to be quite visible, okay, as one thing, not two separate things. So again, totally unrealistic in terms of making the appropriate comparison.
When we deal with waves, because the moment that you have waves coming in, say for instance we have plane waves coming in like this, then the wave can go through both openings simultaneously, and that changes the picture quite dramatically. It was known, of course, already in the 17th century that if you have water waves going through a small opening, so here are water waves moving in like so.
The Piro types pay attention here, because he's showing water waves, right? So he's using the analogy of water waves, And how does he show them leaving?
That what you see coming out there are circular waves. The waves then look like this, and they're propagating out in a circular fashion. And if the velocity of the...
Right, so he knows that, this analogy doesn't really work, because he knows that photons doing that same thing won't do this. They won't come out as one wave. They'll somehow create two waves that interfere with each other. So he knows this analogy won't even work. And it's in complete contradiction to what people are trying to argue, is that somehow water waves have a interference, they create an interference pattern when they don't. They call it a diffraction pattern that has whatever variance in it. Diffraction is just that curved line. Diffraction isn't interference.
Wave here is the same as the velocity there, then the wavelength here would be the same as the wavelength there. But if the velocities are different, of course, you will see a change, a difference in the wavelength. So Huygens, my countryman, suggested in the 17th century the idea, which is now known as Huygens' principle, that we can think of this in a very different way. Huygens, by the way, is difficult to pronounce. Anyone of you who knows how to say Huygens correctly is also Dutch, because you miss the ui in your language and you miss the in your language, and the combination of ui and is a complete killer for you.
I wish I could have skipped right over that.
To my office and say Huygens, but it will certainly put you in the Dutch category.
So clearly he has some sort of affinity for, his national. He should just wear the flag. He should just make his shirt into a flag or something, because he seems to have a huge bias towards people of my kind making the right observations. We're better scientists. He clearly has a little bit of whatever nationalism still in him, even though he's living in fucking America.
So in the 17th century, then Huygens came with an idea which was later amended by Fresnel in the 19th century, and is now known as the Huygens, I will pronounce it your way, the Huygens Fresnel principle.
All right, which he doesn't use at all in this whole lecture. So he doesn't apply it. It's just bullshit. He doesn't apply it to this experiment, doesn't do it at all.
Which works as follows. If we have a plain monochromatic wave, and it's incident on a screen with an aperture, so this would be an aperture, an opening. Here you would have two apertures, two openings. Then the Huygens Fresnel principle states the following. All points in the aperture plane may be thought of as secondary point sources of spherical waves.
So all points, which to them becomes an infinite number of points, right? He's saying how many points are there between the surfaces? Well, what's a point? Well, points are infinite, infinitely small points. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
And the point sources replace the real source, which is flooding the screen, and the screen itself is a perfect absorber of the radiation falling upon it. And so I will repeat the Huygens Fresnel principle, which I will need today. All points in the aperture
So he won't need it for this entire two-slit explanation.
plane may be thought of as secondary point sources of spherical waves. In the case that we have water, this is a two-dimensional surface, they would be circles. But when you deal with light, you can think of them as three-dimensional, that means spherical.
Right, and it doesn't work. So we're right back to this nonsense. Okay, I mean, the Huygens principle is, the Huygens principle will not explain why there's two waves in the single slit. They'll just say the words Huygens and pretend that they made two waves for some magical reason. There'll be no explanation for what cuts the slit in half, right? Yeah, you can see the thing, that's all that matters. So if I have a single slit, they make two waves, okay, and cause them to interfere with each other. Now, there's no explanation from Huygens why there would be two waves. Huygens would say there's one wave. Why would there be two? There's no reason for two waves to come out of there. And in the double slit, they do the same thing, except the Huygens only creates two waves. So somehow the single slit isn't creating two waves inside of it. All right? So that doesn't work. And the math that actually works, as I've pointed out, would do this. Okay, the wave would be here and here. And then the wave would be here and here. Right, doesn't make any sense at all. How does half the wave go, half of two of the waves go right through the middle impediment, and it somehow half the wave goes through this surface? Right, because the point sources are here. That's what the math even says. The math says d, distance. This is the distance. These are the point sources. It doesn't say here, 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 here. None of that is in the math. Those other distances are never in the math. They never do the integral.
Now, the Huygens Fresnel principle is very powerful, though there is a wide range of opinion to its scientific merit. And in a very famous book, The Principle of Electrodynamics by Melvin Schwartz, I read the following, and I quote.
Okay, I probably should look up Melvin because, yeah, good. One scientist who could say the truth, who could admit it doesn't make any fucking sense.
Quote verbatim from his book. He says Huygens' principle tells us to consider each point on a wavefront as a new source of radiation and add the radiation from all the new sources together. Physically, this makes no sense at all. Light does not emit light. Only accelerating charges emit light. Thus, we will begin by throwing out Huygens' principle completely. Later, we will see that it actually does give the right answer for the wrong reasons. So I will proceed my lecture to...
So it doesn't actually give the right answer because the waves are in positions that they can't possibly exist in. So it can't be a wave because the waves are in places waves would not be created.
Today to get the right answer, but perhaps for the wrong reason. Suppose now we have a...
He won't get the right answer. So again, it's key to this whole argument. He says he gets the right answer. He doesn't actually demonstrate that he gets the right answer. He just claims he got the right answer. But he won't get the right answer.
Electromagnetic wave, I'm
Because it doesn't work.
particularly thinking of light, and I have here an opening, and I have here an opening, and plane waves are coming in from the left.
So part of this is he just keeps redrawing the same experiment over and over again. So he does it 3 different times at least, which is kind of funny also.
Moving with the speed of light. And at this opening be A, and at this opening be B. And here the center of the two is O. This could be a circular opening, it could also be a slit. Most of the experiments I will do today are with slits, which are perpendicular to the ground. So they are very narrow openings. Imagine now here a point P. And so the wave from point A will reach that point P, but the wave from source B will also reach that point.
Right, and he'll do the same thing with a single slit, remarkably, to create the interference. So the edges of the slit is obviously what is the only thing that's relevant. So here he's claiming there's 2 spherical waves that come out of this experiment and create a point P. Well, we know that there's 2 patterns, so that can't work. Okay, this simple young description creates the wrong pattern. The real pattern is the double slit pattern. It has a real form to it, and the only way you can do it in unusual ways that aren't common. Okay, like a very specific thing you can do. You can either make the single impediment insanely small, okay, or you can make the slits insanely small. And the key would be is if you make the slits really, really, really tiny, okay, then the difference between this and the difference between this distance will be so small that the 2 bars will essentially fall on top of each other. And so you won't be able to see the fact that there's 2 patterns because the 2 patterns will be almost the same pattern, right? And so that way you can eliminate what happens in all the other circumstances. So in all the circumstances where you vary the impediment and you vary the size of the openings, okay, in all of those circumstances, 99.99% of the cases, you'll have a pattern that'll have 2 elements to it. It'll have bars, and then the bars will stop, and you'll have bars, and that will be the real pattern. You'll have a missing bar here, and a missing bar here, and likewise a missing bar here. And that's the real 2-slit pattern, all right? And you can't miss it in most cases. And there's only certain ways you do the experiment where you'll make this not very visible. That is, it'll either be too far away and you won't be able to see it, or you'll have the slits width so small that the envelope pattern is the same size as this pattern.
So the electric vectors there are going to be added, of course, vectorially. Imagine now that BP...
So the electrical vectors is just more rubbish talk. This has nothing to do with electricity and all that kind of crap. There's just no such thing. And this is just pointing out really just the intensity, right? How much of a photon you got.
Minus AP, imagine that were 1/2 wavelength. Then what you get is that the mountain of the E vector here will coincide with the valley of the E vector from the other one.
So the point would be is there'd be no contribution from one because it's doing the dead space part. So it's a frequency. The photon's coming at a frequency. And all he's saying is as well, at some locations, like if I put them out of phase, if I put 2 pieces of light out of phase, you can understand that when they're in phase, I get 2 photons, right? Well, when they're out of phase, I'm only going to see one or the other, right, if I can detect them. But that's the key. You have to be able to detect them. So if I put them out of phase, we're saying that, well, one arrives, okay, when the other one doesn't produce anything. So if you're going to make photons out of the pieces, you obviously can't make a new photon out of the pieces if they're not in the same phase. If they're out of phase, it means that one showed up and the other contribution doesn't exist. And the only time you can see it is when both contributions exist. So that's all you're really saying. Is it, are there 2 contributions, or are we missing a contribution? If we're missing a contribution, no photon. So it's just basically saying they're pieces, you know, A, B, and you need an A-B pair to see a photon. Well, if they're out of phase, you never see any A-B pairs.
And so you will get the situation that light plus light will give darkness. We call that destructive interference. The wave from here and the wave from there would be 180 degrees out of phase.
So it just means you received a piece of a quanta of energy from A, and you didn't receive one from B. And the only time you see a photon is when you both have an A and a B, both are sending a quanta at the same time.
And if you take all the points for which the difference is 1/2 lambda, that is a hyperboloidal surface. It's like a ball. Not only in the blackboard, it also comes out of the blackboard. It's like a ball. Remember from your high school days.
That's just an acknowledgement that it really is a straight line, and he's putting the straight line on a curved surface. So it's really not. Okay. So if he just drew it different, you'd be able to see that, oh, okay, this isn't about hyperboloids or boboloids or any of these loidy things. It's just about the fact that he's viewing it on a flat plane, which is just the wrong way to see it. So if you can sort of understand that what you're really measuring is the distance between this line, right? You know, the length of a line. The length of the line from, say, some endpoint. This line versus this line. Okay, and how many photons, how many wavelengths fit in that difference? And that's really all you're doing. So when you swing it out, you're swinging at equidistance. So here, the 2 sources are the same distance, and here, the 2 sources are the maximum difference in distance. And you're just going from, that's all you need. And so all you have to do is calculate, okay, how many wavelengths you have. You know they're going to put, that will make how many notches you have. So you just divide wavelength into this circumference, you know, 1/4 of the circumference of the circle, and you've got the answer. So you don't need to do any of this angle stuff. You don't need to worry about hyperboloids. I mean, the fact is, it's going to be, this piece is going to travel a straight line, this piece is going to travel a straight line, and there's no hyperboloids.
If the sum of the distance AP and BP is a constant.
No, what's really wrong with him drawing that hyperboloid is he's not accounting for the fact that as you move the surface, if I move the screen, even if I had a flat screen and I moved it closer, I'm not going to be seeing the same photons. The same locations aren't going to be where 2 of them are constructive and destructive. I'm changing which photon I'm going to see. I'm not going to see these straight lines anymore. I'm going to see a different set of straight lines. As I move the screen in, a different set of straight lines are going to create a photon. That's why he's drawing that line. But it isn't true. That would only be true if if you made the same point, the same constructive interference. The same point won't be. The pattern won't stay in the same location. The light spots won't stay in the same location. They're going to move their location as you move the screen in and out.
Then you get an ellipse. But if the difference is a constant, you get a hyperbola. So you will get a hyperboloidal surface. And everywhere on that surface, B minus AP would then be 1/2 lambda. And then you would get
So there's no surface created. These are different photons. There's nothing traveling this line. It's completely superfluous to the subject, really. It's completely an illusion, a fake, an unreal number. It's not real. It's not a real thing that really happens. Nothing travels this hyperboloid.
Amazing consequence that light plus light would give darkness. Destructive interference.
So again, it's more nonsense, because it's not light plus light. It's light out of phase. So radio plus radio gives no radio. We know that's true, right? Everybody should know that's true, right? Radio plus radio can give you no radio. I take two radio stations and I blare them off out of phase, and I won't be able to tune in either one unless I have a directional antenna. I'll get nothing. Are you saying the radio waves aren't there? Of course they're not. Of course they're still there. You can't receive them is the only issue. You can't decipher between the two pieces of energy hitting you. They're still hitting you. This gets back to like the radar experiment and that stupid fucking Stephen Bro retard. Because he still doesn't understand what my argument against putting a tone on in the radar experiment, right? So you see the radar experiment, the key difference is you're creating two signals that are not hitting anything. You're not breaking any of the photons, right? So you have two signals in phase. So the two signals are guaranteed to be in phase. And you're sending them to different locations. So obviously some locations it's closer to this one and further from this one. So they're going to be out of phase. And this location though, the photons never got broken. You're not sending pieces of a photon to a location anymore as you are with light. When you put light through a slit, you're sending pieces of the light and then recreating a photon. In this example, the photon never gets broken. There's still microwaves coming from this location, and there's still microwaves coming from this location. Somehow microwave plus microwave equals no microwaves. No, the microwaves are still hitting. They're just out of phase. So if you just measured the energy of the microwaves, okay, without listening for an audio signal, the reason why you can't hear the audio is because you can't decide, your tuner can't decide which signal is the right signal. It can't see the signal because now it's been blocked by being out of phase. So it can't decipher it. So if I used a directional antenna here though, then I could see that the microwaves from this direction are still hitting it, and the microwaves from this direction are still hitting it. I could get the tone. All I have to do is make a directional antenna, one that only sees this one, or only sees this one, and the signal's still there. So this is just jamming, okay? That's all this is, okay? There's nothing else happening. There's no interference at all. There's just jamming interference in the sense that you're sending two separate signals out of phase, and your receiver can't handle it. So if you just make a better antenna, you'll hear the tone, and you'll hear the tone. The energy's still getting, all of it is still there. You're just not able to receive it.
Tomatoes don't do that. One tomato on top of another tomato does not give no tomato. That is distinctly different from particles. Now, of course, there are also hypertoroidal surfaces for which there is...
So, again, it's not distinctly different because, again, who's arguing that you can do it without the photon having a frequency? So again, if you're going to make the tomato analogy have anything to do with the photon analogy, you have to recognize you have to give the tomatoes a frequency. And if you give them a frequency, you can have tomato plus tomato, or you can have tomato and not a whole tomato. So again, you can recreate the same circumstance by making it time dependent. When does the tomato pieces arrive? And if you make them arrival dependent, then you'll have the same phenomenon, where you'll get pieces at the same time and places where you won't get pieces at the same time.
Constructive interference. In other words, if I make this difference n times lambda, whereby n is either 0 or plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 2, then I would get surfaces for which we get constructive interference. Then the phase difference...
Right, and that is a limited number. That number of n's is completely dependent on distances. So the distance from this surface and this surface, the two interior surfaces, will create one pattern. The difference in distance from A to the outside of B, how many frequencies are in there, will give you the other number. They'll tell you exactly how many will fit on the arc. So you're done with the experiment. You know how many places it can be constructive and destructive. N is a finite number. It is not a forever number. It's finite. There's a finite number of angle differences that create a length differences in the lines. And then you run out. So by broadcasting it on an infinite plane, they make it seem like it's an infinite number of n's. There is no infinite number of n's. There's a finite number of n's, and that finite number tells you exactly how big each one of the bars are going to be, because it tells you exactly how many there are wherever the distance is. Whatever the distance of your arc is, it'll tell you exactly how many bars will be on that arc.
The difference between the two waves is either 0 or 2 pi or 4 pi. So we have surfaces with constructive interference, and then we have surfaces with destructive interference, and that's going to be at the heart of what I want to discuss with you now.
So I think he's going to
start
draw it again.
Drawing. I think we don't need this anymore. And I will now have a screen with two narrow openings. They could be slits, as I said.
Third time. Draw exactly the same thing.
Opening, and here is the other opening, and let the separation between them be D.
All right.
And the upper one, you can call source
Notice, well, I'm going to play all of this, but anyway, notice again,
now that
he doesn't talk about this slit opening. So he gives us one distance, the distance between these two surfaces, draws it kind of funny, but that's what he's doing, this distance, the distance of the internal impediment. He has that distance. He's not telling us how big those holes are. It's just such a critical, you know, that variable has to be important. That variable has to be playing a role, and yet it doesn't exist. He's going to do mathematics telling us this is a description of the experiment, and it doesn't have in the mathematics a critical variable, the width of that slit. You know, I know that if I change the width of that slit, I'm going to change the pattern, yet the variable isn't in their math. I mean, doesn't that give you an indication that all this hype about how their math is so perfect is just hype? Clearly not perfect math. Missing a key variable not even accounted for.
are looking at this at a distance which is very far away. Very, very far away. And where you are located in space, seen from this point, is an angle theta.
Right. And the simple thing to do is say we're just going to make it equidistant. So let's just draw a circle from here to here. Make all of this, from the center line, make it all equidistant. And if you do that, you'll get pretty quickly the understanding, oh yeah, there's only a certain number of thetas from these 2 points that would be constructive interference. That's all there are. There's only a certain number of ends. And all I have to do is say, what's the number of ends, the number of wavelengths in D, how many wavelengths, so I just divide D by the wavelength of the light. So I know now I get a number, let's say I get a number like 500. So I have something like 1/4 of a millimeter or something. I get a number like 500. So I know there's going to be 500 little end numbers. There's going to be 500 little nodes created in a 90-degree arc. Okay, in a 180-degree arc it'd be 1,000. So I know that on one side I'm going to get 90. There's going to be 90 places where the two lines will constructively add up. The two lines from this point to this point. And so I know it's 500. And then I can do the same thing with this distance. How many wavelengths are in this distance? And that'll tell me what the envelope is. And then I'll know exactly what those little X's are. Those places where there's no bar and there should be a bar. So it's a simpler way of doing the math. It's the same exact math, it's just done accurately, and it accounts for both openings. It accounts for this surface, this surface, this surface, and this surface. It just accounts for them in pairs, but it doesn't matter how you pair them. The fact is there's 4 surfaces. 1, 2, 3, 4 surfaces, and all you do is put the 4 surfaces into the math, and you've got the answer.
Oh, the wave from this source will reach you. And since that point is very far away, these lines here are, of course, parallel to each other. Very.
So he says parallel to each other. No, they're not actually parallel, so what's the point of saying they're parallel? Blah, 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 blah.
Close to parallel.
Very close to parallel. Blah, 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 blah.
The wave that comes from this one has to travel over a larger distance than the wave that comes from this one. And that difference can easily be expressed algebraically if this angle is 90 degrees.
So I'm saying it can obviously be more easily expressed as just being a subdivision of the arc of an equidistant line. So if I just put an equidistant, if I just put a sphere on here, and I have that's equidistant from some center point, and that'll tell me exactly. I don't need to do any of this sine angle crap. I don't have to do any of that crap. I just take that circumference and divide it by the number of wavelengths in the distance. So I just divide the distance by the wavelength. I take that number, okay, and divide it into the circumference of the line, the arc. And that's it. I'm done.
Is this much. That is how much further this wave has to travel than this one, and then they vectorially add very far away at the location where you happen to be. And this difference here is d sine theta. That's immediately obvious. If this angle is theta, this angle is also theta. So the path difference is d sine theta. And that
so again, you could sort of understand that what they're really doing is accounting for the fact that it is a circle. that you're really supposed to be displaying this on. In a sense, the sine theta is basically saying the angle is a piece of an arc. So by arcing it, you're telling you that this distance difference is the difference of a circumference. It's not a difference of this, triangle.
Translates into a phase angle difference between the E vectors. Theta. First of all, d sine theta, which is the path difference, this is how many wavelengths you can fit on that path difference. So I divide it by lambda. And for each wavelength that I can fit on there, the phase difference is going to be 2 pi. And so the phase angle, the difference between the wave from here and there, is therefore 2 pi times d divided by lambda times sine theta.
Right, when he could have just done d divided by lambda times, divided into the circumference of any circle, defining the L difference, the length, the distance away. So just take the arc of the distance away, multiply that by 4 pi to get the circumference, and you're done. It's just 4 pi, so all you do is 4 pi times the distance. So go the distance from this center line, wherever, just pick a distance, okay, multiply it by 4 pi, then divide it by the n number, which is just lambda into d. There, math is done. And that'll tell you exactly how far each node is in terms of how many millimeters or centimeters.
And so now I can set the condition for constructive interference. So constructive interference. What I want is, I want delta to be a multiple times 2 pi. So again, I already wrote that down earlier, but I will do that again. N can be 0, it can be plus or minus 1, it can be plus or minus 2, etc. If n is 0, by the way, you are right at this plane, which comes perpendicular out of the blackboard. Clearly, when you're on this plane, when n is 0, the distance to any point on the plane from source number 1 and source number 2 is obviously the same. You can also write down that d sine theta.
It won't be, okay, in the single slit experiment, because the single slit has the opening in the middle. So it's getting more light is going through, and the laser beam itself spreads and ends up making the middle node huge. They have no accounting for that. They just changed the math a little bit to account for the fact that, we'll have to add an extra node to that middle section because it's too big.
And I did it a little n.
So they don't start with 0, they start with 1 in the middle. So they can force the middle to be double.
Which makes connection with this n, it has nothing to do with index of refraction. That d sine theta is now a multiple times 1 wavelength. That's the same thing. So this statement here is the same as this statement. There's no difference between them.
So let's understand, this is absolutely useless in the sense that he's not acknowledging the fact that there's 2 patterns. So he's just describing one pattern, as if the 2-slit experiment creates just one pattern, that there aren't 2 patterns. He's not acknowledging anything real about the real experiment, the most real thing about it almost.
And now we can write down the condition for destructive interference. So now you want that delta is pi, 3 pi, 5 pi. So now you have delta equals 2n minus 1 times pi. And if you want to write it down in terms of the d sine theta, then you get that d sine theta of n, which is that n that you see there, is now 2n minus 1 divided by 2 times 9.
So again, you don't need any of this more complex way of analyzing it. You can just analyze it the simple way by just drawing the circle. You could actually measure how long the circle's line is, okay, without even doing any complex math. Just put a string on it, then measure how long the circle, so you don't have to do 4 pi times anything. You can reduce the math to almost nothing. It's just the number of wavelengths. The distance is converted into a number of wavelengths, and you just divide the number of wavelengths into your bigger circle. Okay, you'd have a little point source. Now you're going to divide it into a point, 2 point sources, a distance, and you're just going to divide that distance essentially, the wavelength number distance, into this big circle, and that's it. Wherever that circle is, however far away you want to make it.
And so this is at the heart of the idea of the interference, in this case, of 2 of these sources, 2 slits or 2 circular openings. Let me check that we have that right. D sine theta, the n makes connection with the n, equals n lambda. Delta is a multiple of 2 pi. Destructive interference, we get 2n minus 1 times pi. Yes, I can live with that. Now I want to be quantitative.
He uses that term, quantitative.
because I'm going to do a demonstration very much with the numbers that you're going to see now on this blackboard. I'll give this back to you, although you may not need it.
That won't happen.
So we now have the two openings.
So he's
all the way
going to
on the
draw
left
it
here.
a fourth time. Okay, a fourth time he's going to draw the same wrong analysis. The same cheat of the truth.
And they're so close together, so this is that screen, they're so close together that you can't even separate them anymore. So this is the point where the two openings are. And we are going to look on the screen, which is far away.
So again, it's a little bit silly to say we can't, because the opening is actually huge compared to the size of a fucking photon. At least in terms of one dimension of its polarization, it's really, really huge. You can get a lot of photons going this way through it.
So here is a screen, which is going to be that screen. And we want to see how the constructive interference, that means light, shows up on the screen, and how the destructive interference, that means darkness, shows up on that screen. And so here are these two openings. So light comes in from the left. And let this distance be L. And so I want to know, if I look under an angle theta, as seen from the slits, I want to know what kind of pattern I will see. Let's call this x equals 0. And we call this x, positive x, and that's negative x. Now you can also say that the sine of theta...
So this is being more quantitative, right? Where he's actually just going to do the same thing and totally ignore what the two slits are really about, two distances. The distance from the outside slits, the distance between the interior slits. The closest distance versus the furthest distance. And that's what's in the experiment. That's the reality.
If you want that, is approximately x divided by L, but that's only true for small angles of theta. And with this kind of interference, we sometimes have angles of theta which are not small at all. So I want to warn you that this is not something you can use universally, but today you will see that we can use it. So I start now with red light, lambda, is 600 nanometers. So that's the light I will use. So I use monochromatic light. And we will have a distance to the screen, which is about 5 meters. The setup is here. This is about 5 meters. And we have light from a red laser, which is a little larger than 600 nanometers.
So he has the laser quite a distance from the slits. So that's an important thing to understand. So the laser is really far from the slits. And you're going to see in his pattern there's little circles of light. Perfect little circles. Which indicates, okay, that's the catch. The further away you put the laser, the more round the bars get. The closer the laser is to the slits, the more square they get. Sort of, it makes sense in the sense that the focal length, you understand when you do something, you're going to make a shadow, the shadow goes away as you go further and further away from the object, the shadow gets less and less distinct. But if you're really close to the object, the shadow gets very obvious, like with a needle or something. And you're making a shadow of the needle. The shadow is really strong when you have it close, and it's really weak when you go further and further away.
But I just want some round numbers. And the separation here, D, between the two slits, is 1/4 of a millimeter. Now you may think that that is rather small. Well, you will see that that's...
No, you would say that's rather large. Okay, so we know 1/4 of a millimeter is 250 micrometers, which is 25,000 nanometers, which means, well, something like that. I probably should go the other way around. But anyway, there's at least 2,000, you could say, 2,000 nodes would be created on one, so at 600, well, it's a little less than that, so 1,500. It's either 500 or 1,500, depending on how poorly or rightly I'm doing the math. There's 1,000 nanometers in a micrometer, and then 1,000 more micrometers in a millimeter. So anyway, it's a lot. Okay, a lot of wavelengths fit in 1/4 of a millimeter. A lot.
You need very small values of D to even see this phenomenon.
So he says very small, but obviously it's not very small compared to what the 500 nanometers of the wavelength. Which again is proportional to the polarization, which is more the function here. The frequency is proportional to the polarization. And it's the polarization that's pretty much deciding what gets broken going into the slits.
What n is. Let's evaluate what delta is. Let's evaluate what the sine is of theta of n. And then we will evaluate what x of n is. And we will do that for constructive interference. So the numbers that you're going to see here.
See, the interesting thing, all these experiments they don't do, but I mean, maybe polarize the light before it goes into the slits. It might be an interesting experiment to see how much the difference is between light you send in going this way and light you send into the slits going this way. So light going in with the direction of the slits and light you put in going against the direction of the slits. But it's science. They don't bother with doing all those experiments.
Is for constructive. And of course, if you want to, you can do the same exercise for destructive interference. I need constructive interference, so I have to turn to delta is that, and I make them n times 2 pi. And I start with n equals 0. Well, that's easy. N is 0, delta is 0, the sine theta n is 0, and x of n is 0. That's where you will see maximum light. Constructive interference. Obviously, that's the plane that goes right through the middle of those two openings, and the distance to each one of those sources everywhere on that plane is, of course, the same. And so you expect here to see light maximum. Now I go to plus or minus 1, and I calculate now what delta is, then I get plus or minus 2 pi. And so the sine is now 2.4 times 10 to the minus 3. You can check that, because you know what the d sine theta is n times lambda, and I told you what lambda is. D sine theta is now n times lambda, and we take x.
So that's where you did the part where you divide the d by lambda.
N equals 1, and you know what lambda is, you know what d is, so you can calculate the angle sine theta. And that translates then into an x value of about plus n minus 1.2 centimeters. So now I know what the sine of theta is, and I use the small angle approximation, which is more than adequate, and I know now where on this screen I get, again, maxima. And that is then here, 1.2 centimeters on this side, and 1.2 centimeters on the other side, because you get, of course, plus as well as minus. And then I can continue for n equals 1, n equals 2, I will just do plus or minus 10, so then you get here plus or minus 20 pi. So then you get here 24 times 10 to the minus 3.
Probably should just jump ahead of this.
It's almost linear.
Well, he starts drawing again, so
all right. Is still the same as theta in radius.
Well, let's just jump. I mean, he's not saying anything here. He really isn't.
And so the destructive interferences are here. And so you get light curves, light intensity, just like this. Light intensity, remember, is always the pointing vector. So this is light intensity.
All right, now a key point here is they never really talk about how much of the surfaces ends up being lit and how much is dark. So proportionally, there's nothing like this, any proportionality. It's like the photons don't go light and dark halfway through that curve. So the light bars are always bigger than the dark bars. Dark bars are always smaller. But there are circumstances where the light, like that, changes, where the light is in 90%, okay, of the image, and the dark bar is only 10%. I mean, huge differences in intensity. And they don't even describe what creates that. Why is that? There's no explanation for why constructive photon plus photon doesn't always equal photon. How does it equal? You know, how do photons still be getting here as a whole photon? I can still see some. How are some of them still photons? They're more likely to be a photon here, but they're less likely to be one here, but they're still photons there. Why?
And that is in watts per square meter. Now the first thing that I want you to notice, and you will see that today in various demonstrations, is that the location of the maxima depends on the wavelength. So that means if red light, 650 nanometers, if that falls here as a maximum, and it falls here as a maximum, and it has here a maximum, and it has there a maximum, that blue light, which would have a wavelength, say, I picked 400 nanometers.
This is all kind of obvious stuff, so I'll move ahead. We all agree that the frequency decides how many places you have the nodes, and so smaller frequency is going to have more nodes.
And that's why you get minima. That's the whole idea of the interference pattern. Now, if you're very far away from the two openings...
Obviously, if you're dividing a smaller number into the distance, you're going to have more nodes. So yes, they're going to be in a different location depending on the color of the light. So the smaller the wavelength, the more of the wavelength fits in the distance. That's sort of so kind of, you should just be able to state it and move on.
Then these E vectors are, of course, very closely the same. Remember, E is proportional to 1 over R, but if the distance R is very closely the same, then we can assume, to good approximation, that the E vector and the amplitudes are the same. So that means the total...
So this E vector stuff doesn't mean a damn thing. They never really measure the total energy hitting the location. So again, I've argued that if you actually did this, sensing how much heat was created, that you'd find out that there is no such thing as this destructive crap. That just as much energy is hitting all locations. It's just the energy hits it in phase. In some locations you can get the energy, you can receive the radio. Other locations you just can't receive the radio because it's broken. It's out of phase, it's jammed. Essentially, the photon is jammed by being out of phase.
E vector that you get, the sum of the two, factorial sum of the two, is then going to be 2E0, I simply call it E0 now. And then I get the cosine of half the sum. So I get the cosine of omega t minus delta divided by 2 times the cosine of half the difference. So that becomes the cosine of delta divided by 2.
So he's just basically taking this formula and turning it into a Maxwellian analysis. And it doesn't, again, it isn't accurate because he's not really measuring the energy. He's just measuring the energy converted into a photon.
So now you see why the light intensity is proportional to cosine square delta over 2. Because when you calculate the mean value of the Poynting vector, you have to take E cross B. And so B also has this term, and also has this term. And so you get the square of this term, and the square of this term. But the average of the square of this term is 1/2.
There's no way they ever measure this, so this is another part of the fraud. They don't measure the intensity that actually gets to the location and say somehow it's 2x. 2x of what? They didn't measure how much light was going in, so how can they measure it's twice as much? Right? Because they didn't measure how much total light went in. So until they do that experiment, actually recognize that, oh, they're only getting a quarter of the light they actually put into the experiment. Right? The amount of light per surface area of the slits is going to be 1/4, maybe, of the amount of light you're actually going to interpret. You're actually going to see as photons. So you really have diminished the light substantially.
That's for now. And so you see it is going to be proportional to the square of delta over 2. And so this function that you see, delta is linearly proportional to sine theta. This curve that you see is a cosine square curve.
Right, but there's absolutely they never measured it, so they have no way of proving that at all. They're just stating it for the sake of drawing it.
The experiment that I'm going to show you has a separation of the slits, which is 1/4 millimeter.
In the radar experiment, this comes up because the intensity of the signal, the on parts, when you block one of them, you get when you have both of them open, you get 4 times as much of a signal. But that happens because of the way the signal, the audio signal, is being interpreted by the receiver. The receiver is causing that effect. And it's the same effect that would be caused by 2 radio stations broadcasting the same signal to a location. If you split the antennas into 2, you can increase the amplitude of the carried signal by 4.
My wavelength is 633 nanometers, which is very much the same, and the distance to the screen is about 5 meters. And so the way that we have this arranged is that the 2 slits, they're vertical, they're like this. So this separation is 1.4 millimeter, and then we put over there a laser beam, and then the result is what you're going to see there. And so, now, what to think about.
So all of this, like I said, a real analysis would take into all these things into consideration. Again, so this experiment, unlike most of them that are done, there's a good deal of distance, a whole meter maybe, between the distance between the laser and the slits. So it's a big distance, and it's going to have a consequence in terms of what you see.
You're going to see it there, and in order for you to see it, I have to make it completely dark. When you look here on the screen, you will see areas.
All right, so you can't see them very clearly here. This is poorly done, but he's obviously got very small slits. So it's a very powerful laser using very tiny slits, and that's why this pattern is faint. That's why I had to turn off the lights and all that kind of crap. they're round because the laser is further away from the slits. So the light that's going through them is more parallel, you could argue. But clearly you see the pattern over here. Clearly you see the pattern over here. Clearly you see that it goes to nothing. So clearly you see the two patterns. He doesn't account for their existence at all. They don't exist in his book. That isn't a phenomenon. That isn't something really happening. It isn't part of the double slit experiment. He's just going to explain this. And that is just cheating.
Which are distinctly dark. And you see areas whereby you see the light. In other words, you see the pattern that we just calculated. You see constructive interference, and you see...
All right, the catch is we don't know whether they inserted this image. So this might not be what was actually on his wall. It looks a little bit too perfect, you know, in terms of the blackness, the contrast, all that kind of stuff. So it could be that this was just replaced. So these numbers, his 1/4 of a millimeter number doesn't really make sense to this envelope pattern. So this envelope wouldn't be created by a 1/4 of a millimeter opening. I guess I'll pause. Jeez. Should be back. I'm getting a thank you for using Visa, MasterCard, and American Express all at once. Yeah. I'm going to get a reward. I wonder if Baldy Catz would do a video debate with one of these phone spamming people. Yeah, as I say, they should be killed. I should say it's an international violation of international law. We should find them and kill them. They're just too useless. This spam shit. Fuck you. Kill them. They're just too low a creature. They're worse than bugs. They're worse than mosquitoes. We should have an international, program set up to eradicate them.
Destructive interference. And you're looking here at an experiment that is historically of great importance. It is one of the most mysterious and puzzling issues in all of physics.
Right. So he just explained it. It wasn't very published. Two waves go in, no problem. That's not hard to explain. The real pattern, though, is hard to explain. So he totally failed in getting to the real mystery, getting to the real part that's a problem. And it's just doing this, it's constructive and deconstructive. But again, just simple, you just fix the whole thing. You make the whole thing really understandable by understanding first that photons are composite objects. Photons are not gigantic blobs, okay? So like if I'm sending radio waves, I'm not sending a gigantic blob of energy, right, that's a mile long. No, that's the mile long part is the nothing space. It's the space that doesn't have anything in it.
This interference pattern, which was first shown by Young in 1801, is clearly convincing.
Right, so it wasn't what Young saw. Young saw just this little bit of this, right? He didn't have any idea about the secondary pattern at all, blah, 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 blah. So Young was, again, just doing a poor man's analysis. And it's just that. It's junk. It has nothing to do with the real phenomenon in the sense that it's missing a fundamental element.
Evidence that light is a wave phenomenon.
So he just said evidence that light is a wave phenomenon. Again, it can be better explained as a particle phenomenon. It can be, and just made out of scatter.
However, 20th century physics has shown that light comes in the form of individual photons with well-defined energies. And
so again, individual photons, that doesn't show that it comes in individual photons. What it's shown is that there's a certain amount of energy required to make something happen, and that's all. But again, what the energy is made out of is little quanta. So they have a thing called quantum mechanics, and they don't seem to understand what quantum is. They don't understand that the quantum means that everything's made out of some elemental bit, and that a photon is also made out of elemental bits. There's no such thing as a photon without the frequency. There's more than one of them.
Photons can behave like bullets. They have momentum, they produce radiation pressure, and they can be localized in space.
Now, if they thought of it as a bullet and said, yes, but to have a photon, I obviously have to have two bullets. I can't have a photon without two bullets. They could understand it that simply. That one bullet isn't going to be a mile long. So obviously, if the distance between the bullets is the wavelength, then I can simply understand that a photon at minimum must have 2 bullets. Can't be something less than that. It has to have 2 quanta. And then that separation defines the thing we call a photon. So a photon isn't 1 bullet, it's 2 bullets at minimum. That simple modification makes the particle theory work just fine.
We can detect individual photons in a way that we detect individual tomatoes. Photons behave like particles. However, the interference pattern that you are staring at on that screen can only be explained if we assume that each photon went through both slits.
All right, so he says it only can be explained. Only. It's the only way to explain it. When, no, of course that's not the only way to explain it. So, I mean, it's just such a bold statement. Only way you have thought of so far, he could have at least said. We haven't thought of some better way particles could work, because you haven't spent any time considering particles as a possibility. And that's the simple truth. You all bought into your little fairy theory, and so you just keep making, it's like the people who believe in UFOs and they're going to see them all over the place. You just bought into something, you see it everywhere now because you're looking for it, not because it's the truth.
But how on earth can one particle go through both slits?
Yeah, nothing goes through both slits, so it's just a pile of crap. Yeah, it doesn't happen.
It will have to be one slit or the other. And here lies the great mystery. Light is both. It is a wave if you want it to be a wave, and it is a particle if you want it to be a particle.
Okay, so that's just baby talk, right? I mean, it's just too stupid. The physical reality is it has to have a physical reality. You can't have contradicting physical reality. So you can't say it's both round and it's square. It's just stupid to say that.
If you manage to determine for every photon through which of the 2 slits it went, and that is possible.
All right, so he just said it is possible. It isn't possible. It is impossible to determine without destroying the photon. So it is impossible, in fact. So why say it's possible? It's not possible.
Do it at low light intensity. You can really determine through which of the 2 slits each photon went.
No, you can't.
Then you will not see any interference anymore.
He says so. Never did the experiment. So he's saying something for which he never did the experiment. He never demonstrated, never proved it, never in any way did it. So it's just a pile of crap, he's saying. Because he never did it.
The pattern on the screen will be like that of the tomatoes. You get 2 piles. So
you get 2 piles in exactly the same location because of the tiny distance between the 2 slits. So the 2 piles will be in exactly the same location. And all you're going to do is have 2 piles that are subtly different. Well, the subtle difference is that, again, the fact is that you're changing from 2 sources and then 2 sources in 2 different locations. And when you combine them, though, you end up with 2 sources that are far away and 2 sources that are close together. And that's the factual difference. You are factually changing from just 2 sources making the pattern to 4 sources making the pattern. That's the real difference. There's no 2 separate, it's like the AB parts of the car are thrown by one slit and the B and the CD parts of the car are thrown by the other slit, right? So they're 2 different things being thrown out of the 2 slits, and obviously the 4 can create the whole car, but just 2 and 2 can't.
The moment that you establish the particle character of the light by determining through which slit it went, you have destroyed its wave character.
So again, this is just more just storytelling. There's absolutely no physical evidence demonstrating this. So this isn't even a subject to interpreting an experiment. They're just interpreting a theory. They haven't interpreted any evidence to say that. They're just interpreting what they think their theory predicts.
And it will not behave like a wave, it will behave like a particle. However, as long as you do not determine through which slit the photon went, thus as long as it remains your guess through which one it went, light will reveal to you its wave character, and you will see interference.
So just mushy, almost godlike storytelling, where he's almost saying it's magical. If you're looking at it, it does one thing. If you don't look at it, it does something different. When looking isn't a real thing, you can't passively look at a photon, so the whole thing is moot.
Choice is yours, but you cannot have both ways. So you're looking now at something that had a huge impact on physics, clearly at the time that this
Yeah, so clearly it didn't have a huge impact until the 1930s. So from 1801 to 1930, over 100 years, it didn't have any impact at all. And then all of a sudden, when they decide to make a bunch of woo physics, then it had an impact.
Experiment was done, it was accepted that light are waves. But we now look at it in a very different way.
So again, even in Newton's, after Newton died, they were already doing this wave thing. The wave thing was just somehow something people wanted. Maxwell turned it all into waves, even though the Maxwell equations are all straight line vectors. You know, people wanted waves for whatever dumbass reason. I don't understand it at all.
I want to show you a slide of this, what we call double slit interference, in white light. We did it in red light.
Okay, so he's going to show us another example of the double slit without the double slit pattern. So without the envelope pattern being visible, without showing what happens when you go further around the circle.
That's the easiest, and you get very sharply defined maxima and minima. And the reason why you get them so sharply defined is because you don't have the interference of the other color. But of course, if you do it with white light, then you will see the blue light has its own spacing and the red light has its own spacing. And the net result, of course, is that you see a somewhat different pattern. And that I will show you here. I will make it a little darker for that. So the upper panel is then the double slit interference in blue light. And you see the clearly dark lines, which are the...
So he doesn't show us how to make the pattern look like this at all, right? But again, the outside fringes are missing. They're not going to show us what it does when it gets dark and then gets light again. So he's just going to show us the middle part, just kind of hide the rest of the pattern. And I don't even buy that this could possibly be a light experiment. Even this one, double slit, might be electrons. But whatever it is, it's wrong. But notice the difference here. Look at the red ones, tiny little black lines, big giant red lines. And then with the blue one, hey, all of a sudden these black lines are getting bigger and bigger, and they're almost the same size as the bright spots. What the hell is that about? And then the white light, yeah, there should be some blending. So, you know, the bar size should change quite a bit, and it does. But just really, do they go into explaining any of that? Why does blue light create big giant black spaces and red light create little tiny dark spaces? All of these questions completely unexplored, uninteresting, just as it is uninteresting for his case of argument in terms of supporting the wave theory. I don't want to show you the real pattern because I can't explain the real pattern. That's the truth. Wave theory doesn't work. And again, just point out again, he nowhere in this part of the video has he used any, you know, Huygens-Fresnel bullshit. So it didn't happen in the two-slit experiment anywhere. They can't apply Huygens in the two-slit experiment because it makes a mess out of it.
The destructive interference locations, and you see, as I already indicated on the blackboard, that the separation of the red is larger, because it's wavelength dependent. And if you then do it with white light, then you see something like this. So it's more difficult to actually see the maxima and the minima.
Well, you can clearly see the differences, the changes, so it does make it quite obvious that something fucking weird's going on.
Now what you can do with light, if you can turn light plus light into darkness, then obviously you should also be able to turn sound plus sound into silence.
Right, so now this application of pretending that sound is the same thing as light, that the movement of atomic molecules is the same as a force, which light is, moving through empty space, and they're not the same. But we'll save that for the next time, I suppose. We'll go back to Feynman maybe and play around with some other stuff and you know, get to this stuff a piece at a time. But anyway, convincing evidence that physics isn't as rigorous and as tied up and as well evidenced and all this stuff as they pretend. Just a simple fact.